What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some video game endings that were unsatisfying, endings that I did not enjoy for one reason or another, endings that I think are bad or whatever else I happen to have titled this video. Because as a guy who sits and plays video games just about all day every day, there's bound to be some situations in there then that I find less than great when it comes to how a narrative wraps up. But I do think it's important, though, to delineate a few things here at the beginning. For starters, I'm not talking about a game with bad endings, because what is generally referred to as a bad ending isn't necessarily always bad, especially if it reflects the choices your character that you are role-playing made, making the, bad things that happen not necessarily out of place or unwelcome. No, the reality here is much simpler. These are endings that for one reason or another I think are just not that good. Or they don't speak to me for some reason, or in one case it's kind of a problem with the genre as a whole rather than the individual game. Which I think is especially important when it comes to a lot of the RPGs I play, because what you want there is a satisfying conclusion to the narrative, and some games simply fail to deliver that, which is the bulk of what this particular video is all about. But let's kick it off with a relatively easy one. The original campaign for Neverwinter Nights 2. Though for everyone immediately jumping into the comments, yes, I will talk about Mask of the Betrayer shortly. But Neverwinter Nights 2 is a game that was developed by Obsidian, actually, that never quite reached the heights of the original one, thanks to things like its tool set that allowed people to create custom campaigns and stuff, and while 2 had some of that, it was harder to work with from what I understand, and for a variety of reasons just never quite had the same impact. But just like its predecessor, while it is a tool set that you can make your own content with or play content from other people, another big part of it, though, is the actual campaigns, the original campaign to be specific, that ultimately sees you fighting against the King of Shadows, as he's known. But after a long campaign of choices, consequences, getting to know your companions, you might hope for a satisfying conclusion to that narrative arc. But unfortunately, that's just not the case for the original campaign, because the entire ending can largely be summed up as rocks fall, everyone dies. That is not an exaggeration, outside of the fact that technically speaking, they're mostly just trapped and they aren't necessarily actually declared dead, which is important when you talk about Mask of the Betrayer here shortly, which largely went about correcting this ending, so to speak. But that doesn't really help the fact that this original campaign, especially before Mask of the Betrayer released, ends with you not really knowing what happened to your main character, any of your party members, with the very big presumption being that they probably just died, which is a real shame given that everything up to that point, even the final battle itself, has a lot of great points, and there are bits of the ending that don't necessarily have anything to do with your party. It's just that that particular moment tends to overshadow the rest of it. But luckily for everyone involved, while I do think it is admittedly a bit of a cop-out, Mask of the Betrayer winds up being good enough to mostly make up for this little bit of a snafu, let's say. But Mask of the Betrayer, if you did not know, continues the main story of Neverwinter Nights 2 by bringing forth your protagonist into that separate side story. I don't want to ruin it if you haven't seen it, but it also can give you some background on what happens to individual companions and leans into some really cool D&D lore that you don't necessarily see in video games a lot. And honestly, that particular bit of DLC, which comes baked into the complete edition over on GOG, by the way, is really the best part of what Neverwinter Nights 2 has to offer anyway, so at least it turned out alright in the end. Next up, however, is a slightly different game with the DioField Chronicle. The DioField Chronicle is an odd duck of a TRPG, because it is a tactical game that is actually real-time with pause, which you don't see many of. I can only think of 2 of them really, and DioField is one of them. And for the most part, it was an, I would say, kind of experimental feeling game that did some different things, some of which worked, some of which didn't, which is probably why it got so many mixed reviews, mind you, but its quality as an overall game is not what we're here to talk about, but rather the ending. You see, the DioField Chronicle has what I would consider one of the boldest endings I've seen in a while, but in a way it also was probably trying to set up for a sequel that I doubt is ever going to happen given the game's reception and sales. But for most of the game, you spend your time with your party primarily between Andreas and Fred, or Fredrit, helping them out with their mercenary company initially as they fight against an ever-encroaching empire after the island you're on's Jade, or magical stones, and the typical JRPG type of stuff. But the catch is right at the end, actually, when you are finally successful, is when the game throws a big twist at you, because one of your main characters has not been on your side the entire time. You see, Andreas executes Fred pretty much on the spot, because it turns out he's actually been working for the Empire this entire time after being abducted and sent there as a child, only to be trained as a spy, sent back to the island, where you slowly infiltrated your way into the good graces of the political system there, which is what allowed for all of this to happen. And Andreas goes on to lead this nation for the Empire at this point, which is, again, a very bold move, but one I ultimately don't enjoy because it kind of undermines everything you've been working for throughout the entirety of the game up to that point, only to throw this big reveal at you and ta-da, the Empire, the bad guys win. And it was just, again, very odd. And I can only assume they were trying to set up for a sequel here, but it was a bummer for sure. Now, number 3 on the list, we have another sort of odd duck of a game, that being Biomutant. So Biomutant is a game that promised a lot and ultimately delivered not as much, frankly. So, in many ways, Biomutant itself was also an experimental title from developer Experiment 101, but unfortunately I think the game's ambition kind of outstriped its ability to actually match said ambition, which is made especially apparent, I think, in the endings, of which there are technically 2, either saving the world tree or destroying it. And while in the lead up to the game's release, it was mentioned how, depending on your actions, the game sort of rolled some stuff behind the scenes to then decide on the ending whether or not you succeeded, basically. So the side activities, things you did or did not do, would build up a chance to either save or destroy the world tree, then leading into your endings, with a technical possibility that you could do everything right and potentially still fail. But it seems like that was abandoned somewhere along the line, and it's instead decided by what tribe you side with all the way back at the beginning of the game, and how you deal with the tribal war situation that colors the rest of the experience. So that's a bummer by itself, but then you actually go through the hassle of getting all the way to the ending, only to find out that even if you were agonizing over that, it's kind of irrelevant anyway, because what happens to your character and the friends you make along the way has precious little to do with whether or not the world is saved or destroyed, because you leave in a rocket ship anyway. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given a game with a story about anthropomorphic animals that don't really talk in any language that we know and must therefore be narrated by the constant droning of somebody sounding like they're commentating on a nature documentary, which may have well been the point, to be fair, doesn't have the best story overall. But this one I didn't enjoy primarily because what they said it was supposed to be going into it just kind of isn't what actually mattered in the end. But I can ultimately forgive Biomutant its sins because it is one of the first games I played with my son, and he loved it, so there's that at least. Moving on to number 4, we then have Elex 2, the much maligned final game of Piranha Bytes, which is deeply unfortunate because I really loved Elex 1. I was therefore very excited to play Elex 2 before being very let down by it, not least of which because its incredibly convoluted ending that does little to advance the story that was built up by the first game, and from the first game it decides to just make a bunch of canonical decisions for you that I didn't love, not least of which because it makes our character a terrible father for starters. But the gist of Elex 2 is that following the events of the first game, you are meant to prepare the world for an incoming invasion of an alien race that we knew was going to happen. We failed to do that miserably. We also failed at being a father in the meantime, so we have a young boy who I think is meant to be like 5, who follows us around for some of the story. More on that in a moment. You had this child with the canonical love interest from the first game, despite it not being the only choice, which is whatever, I guess, but still kind of annoying. And you spend much of the game sort of trying to rally the defenses now that the aliens are here, and it's become a real problem that people can actually see in front of their eyes. Not great, but, fair enough. Until you get to the actual end of all that build-up and everything as you learn these secrets, and it turns out that everything that has happened up to this point is a bit of a misdirection. So, another premise of Elex is that a mysterious substance known as Elex was brought to the planet by a comet roughly 170 years before the beginning of the second game. This magical substance was used for all sorts of purposes, not least of which as an energy source, to grant people all sorts of powers. But what we learn in the second game here is that this was actually a very long-term sort of terraforming idea by another race that is not the alien race we are currently fighting, but different somehow, in order to make Earth suitable for when they arrive. Starting with Elex, which was meant to, of course, latch onto people and transform them into life forms and things that could be made more useful useful to the incoming species. So basically, it's just a rehash of the first game's primary ending, where you defeat the big bad guy and there's an alien race coming in again right after it that you have to prepare for. And then the second game does the same thing. You defeat this alien race only to find out that this wasn't the final one, and there's another alien race coming in the future, which is presumably where Elex 3 would have taken off, but unfortunately Piranha Bytes is closed, so Elex 3 is just never going to happen, and this is just the ending of the Elex games. And if that's not bad enough, on top of being a terrible father, you allowed your son to assimilate into some sort of like AI cloud situation, so he just becomes one with the machinery there, and for whatever reason his mom does not comment, ask, or care about this. And after being very excited from having played the first game and having a blast with it, the second entry, which again was meant to be like the middle of a trilogy, is just a real letdown. Not a good time at all. A very disappointing sequel with a very disappointing ending. Which brings me to my final entry, and I saved this one for last because while I do find the ending rough, it's not exactly this game's fault, but rather the genre, because the game I'm talking about is SKALD Against the Black Priory, which is a very Lovecraftian game, which takes a lot of cues from the Cthulhu mythos, as I'm sure many people are aware, eldritch horrors beyond your imagination, cosmic horror, the whole nine. Now, on one hand, I think the ending for this game is very, very appropriate for that genre, because if you are unaware, what basically happens in every Lovecraftian title in the end, with video games especially, but also more generally with other media, but it's more noteworthy here because of the sort of dissonance I'm about to talk about. But simply put, basically everybody dies, horribly, I might add, and then the game ends with you having sort of reached this cycle. Now, some of it is left to your imagination, deliberately not explained, that kind of stuff, but as I mentioned, this is a common theme for the genre, and I don't think this one is like a bad ending in the sense that it was unexpected or unsatisfying in some way, but rather Lovecraftian horror has a bit of a dissonance problem with video games in particular, because video games by their very nature are an interactive medium that puts player agency, especially in terms of RPGs, at the forefront of that. And so, spending an entire RPG building up characters, getting involved in plot lines, side quests, the whole nine yards, only to get to the end and see everyone die, while it may be very thematic for the genre itself, is disappointing in basically every other regard, because, you're just kind of dead. And so all of that player agency that you've had up to that point kind of just goes out the window, because Lovecraftian horror has got to do what Lovecraftian horror does, which is kill everybody right at the end. And that's such a frustrating thing to me, because I really do love that sort of genre, especially all the stories that are told there. I think a lot of it's really interesting, but then anytime I play a game set within that genre, I pretty much know how it's going to end, because that's how pretty much all of them end. And I don't necessarily need the ending to be good in the sense that everybody gets a happy ending, but rather just a bleak ending that gives these people the potential to at least keep fighting on would be nice every once in a while. Because as it stands, I rarely enjoy the endings of these games as a result. But that, I think, is pretty much where we're going to wrap up this particular video. Hope you enjoyed it more than I enjoyed these endings, at the very least. But with that in mind, I'd love to hear about games with endings you didn't enjoy for one reason or another. I imagine Mass Effect 3 will probably be an easy one for people to mention. Or as an alternative, if you just happen to enjoy any particular ending from a game that you think was particularly well done, by all means, drop it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.